Welcome, everyone. I'm Shreya Naidu from the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences. With me today, we have Pratik sir on the screen as well, Professor Pratik Mutha from the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences. And today for our presentation, we have Professor Carolyn McGettigan from UCL Speech, Hearing and Phonetic Sciences. Professor McGettigan was born and raised in Derry, New Ireland. They completed their BA in Natural Sciences at the University of Cambridge, followed by a PhD in Human Communication Science at UCL. Their research is concerned with understanding the behavioral neural processes involved in vocal communication, and they study that at the VoCoLab at UCL. During the session today, Professor McGettigan will talk about their work and while focusing on the recent use of online data collection platforms. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I invite you to take over the platform.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shreya, and thank you so much for this invitation. So I'll just share my slides. I'm just going to do that once more. I need to play some sounds as well. Okay, great. So I'll probably speak for about 45 minutes. As Shreya said, I'll be talking about my research today, but I'll be trying to emphasize how we've used online methods to collect data and to maybe offer some advice or tips based on my experience of using these platforms. So, of course, if you've come to this session, you've probably already thought to yourself, well, you have some reasons maybe for why you'd want to test participants online. And of course, the obvious one is that we're all living in this pandemic. And indeed, since March 2020, I have had virtually no access to in-person facilities. I've not been allowed to test human participants in person at UCL. And so we've had to, out of necessity, many of us have had to think about ways around that. But actually, as it happens, I've been doing online testing for a bit longer than that. And my motivation started out a little differently. So before I worked at UCL, which is in the centre of London, I worked at another college, which is part of the University of London. And that is, depending on whether you're in a car or in a train, it's about 20 or 40 minutes outside London in a small town. And our problem was that when we wanted to focus on our research during the summer months, when the academic year was over, we had problems because our students had all gone away for the vacation. We had no participant population left on campus, and it was very difficult to recruit people locally. So we were trying to think about how could we continue to do our research with human participants without having to get them to come to the campus, which was quite difficult. So that's why we turned to online research for what we wanted to do. And we can really think about a small number of sort of main considerations when we think about turning to online resources to do our research. So first of all, our main motivation initially was we wanted to find a way to get participants that we couldn't get in person. Of course, you need a means to find those participants on the internet, and I'll talk a little bit about that. You then need a method for how and where you're going to host your studies and what kind of facilities you can use in order to run experiments like you would in the lab. And third, and very importantly, you want to be able to ensure that you're getting good quality data, even though you're moving from outside your very controlled laboratory conditions to the relatively unknown context of people's individual homes and workplaces or wherever they are sitting at their computers to do your experiments now. So in terms of ensuring data quality, this is what I was talking about with this notion of going from our very nice, soundproof room with top quality microphone, great headphones, and a computer that we have calibrated and we understand that the experiments run perfectly. Going from that to a situation where our participant may well be doing the experiment on a computer in an environment that is somewhat controlled, but will present different distractions from in the university laboratory. And I would highly, highly recommend a talk on this aspect of online research and ensuring high quality data, which is given by my colleague, Professor Jenny Rodd, who's also at UCL. And I've included a link and I'll share the slides after this so that you can go and look at that in your own time. But she really goes into detail about, broadly speaking, what are the kinds of main points you want to consider when you want to try and maximize the quality of the data that you get, given that you can't look at your participants, you don't have that same kind of feeling of control over what it is they're doing and the conditions in which they're working. So I am a voice researcher, and I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist by training, although I work now in a speech science department. And I'm going to now talk about the kinds of research that I and my lab do online. But hopefully those of you in the audience who don't work with auditory stimuli or working on different questions within the broad area of human cognition will find that some of these tips will be useful. So just to give you an introduction to the kind of thing I do, I'm interested in the kinds of things that we can extract from human voices as perceivers, and also the information that we put into our own voices when we make communicative sounds in our everyday lives. So if I were to play you a clip of a voice, then you might sort of have a think about, what kinds of information can I get from this person's voice? And I put a few stimulus words on the screen.
Was very intent on us, speaking our own languages, which makes sense. I'm surprised we haven't done it before, but it makes it much more interesting.
So I just put a few words there. Now, hopefully nobody's told me they couldn't hear the sound, so I hope that worked okay. But, you might have extracted very quickly and rapidly some notions of the kind of person this is physically. Maybe this sounds like a male person, an adult. They sound like they're speaking English. Do they sound like that's their first language? Do they have a particular accent that you can recognize? And then you can get into other things that you might be making more guesses at, but you can still try and come up with a hypothesis. For example, are they tall, or are they intelligent? Are they a friendly person? Are they someone you might like to meet? Someone asked if I could minimize presentation window was minimized. Maybe this is something you can look at in the chat and let me know. But you can think about all of these different aspects of someone that you might draw out from what you hear. You also might recognize the person. And in this case, this was an interview clip from Brad Pitt. But recognizing someone's identity is only one part of the puzzle. And there are lots of different things that we can find out about a person or make guesses about or judgments about from a person without actually knowing who they are. So that's the kind of thing I'm interested in my research. And what kinds of tasks do we run? What kinds of experiments do we run to kind of probe those kinds of questions? So thinking about what kind of information can we get from a voice from listening to it, we can think about perceiving the identity of the person. So we can think about giving someone a sound clip and asking them to tell you who is speaking. Could be a famous person that they're trying to guess the identity of. Or you can ask people to discriminate between pairs of sounds and tell you whether they're different people or the same person making them. And we can ask people to also make judgments about the character or the personality of the person that goes with this voice. So we can ask people explicitly to make judgments of their personality traits like trustworthiness or dominance or confidence. But we can also implicitly ask people to perform tasks that might give us some sort of insights into whether or not, for example, they trust the voice. And we can also think about how the listeners themselves and their characteristics might influence their perception of voices. So, for example, in some of our studies, we're interested in the notion of familiarity with voices and how that affects the way that we perceive them. So we might compare people who have watched a television show and are familiar with the voices within it with a group of people who haven't watched that show and they don't know the actors and therefore they have no familiarity previously with those voices. And we can also change the state of a listener during the course of an experiment, for example, by training them to have some familiarity with some voice identities and then giving them some sort of experimental test on their recognition or some other aspect of their processing. So that's kind of our broad questions that we ask about voice perception. And when it comes to voice production, I think not only just of how we physically kind of control all of this apparatus that we use to speak, but also our sense of agency and ownership over a voice. And that's because not all people who use a voice actually speak like I am doing now. So you can think of people, for example, who may have a condition like motor neuron disease, where they're actually communicating via a speech synthesizer and something like text to speech, rather than using the sort of physical apparatus of the vocal tract, the larynx, and so on. So we look at experiments where we kind of give people a novel voice identity and ask them to associate that with themselves. And then we assess their performance in perceiving and processing that voice in tasks. And we also look at how people use voice stimuli. So we look at how they interact with other players, for example, via a synthetic voice in an interactive setting, and see how that changes their perception of that voice in later tasks. And we also do look at the production of the physical voice. And although that can often be highly challenging to do with online methods, we have made a first attempt. So recently we did look at measuring changes in voice pitch when people are performing a task where they have to synchronize their speech with a recording of another voice. I probably won't have time to go into that today, but I have put a couple of slides with some tips in there. So if you are interested, you can take a look. So let's imagine you have the motivation to test online, and I think very few of us lack that motivation here today. And you have some questions that you think you could begin to ask via online experiments. So how do you get started? So let's go back to these 3 points. You want to find your participants. You want to work out how and where you're going to run your task and what it might look like. And then you want to have a consideration of how to try and make sure that your data quality is high. So in terms of finding participants, what I'll speak to is not all of the resources that you have, but rather my own personal experience of looking for participants for online research. And I've really used 2 broad approaches. The first is to recruit people via social media. And this is where we started out when we began doing online research. And we occasionally go to something like Twitter and put an advertisement from our individual accounts or maybe from our lab account. Or we go somewhere like Facebook where there might be specialist participant groups that we can join and advertise to. So, for example, imagine we want to find participants who have a familiarity with a particular set of voices, like the voices of the members of a television showcast. Then what we can do is we can go and advertise on Twitter or Facebook for people who have familiarity with a particular TV show. And we can similarly find people who say they've never seen that show, and we can compare their performance. Currently, one of my PhD students is interested in the rewarding value of voices that we know, and she is recruiting fans of Taylor Swift and Beyonce on Facebook to give them the opportunity to participate in a study where we look at how they respond to those voices as kind of very stimulating, rewarding voices for them. When we don't use these specialist participant groups, we then have most often turned to an online recruitment platform. And the one that we've used most regularly is called Prolific. That is a paid-for service, and it gives us access to a large number of participants situated all over the world. It's an uneven geographical distribution, but still you can have some global reach. You can pre-filter your participants for certain inclusion criteria, such as their age or their gender, if that's relevant, which languages they speak, other aspects of their kind of demographics. And you can advertise your study exclusively to people who meet your criteria. There's good anonymity for the participants. You have secure methods for paying them as well, so you can reward them for their participation. The big negative, of course, is that there are administrative fees. And so if you would want to pay your participants, let's say, £3 to take part in an experiment, you have to pay a surcharge of between 30 and 40% on top for the administrative fees of the platform. So that is, of course, a consideration depending on your funding situation. So let's imagine we found a way to find some participants. Of course, you might have a database at your university where you can recruit people that way, and then you can redirect them to the online platform. So now you have to think about how and where to run your studies. And I'm going to give examples from my own experience today of 3 different platforms that we have used to do our research. The first is one called Qualtrics. This is a paid-for software. Often a university might have a license to use this software and let their researchers use it. It's a basic survey software. So if you're doing research, for example, where you want just responses to surveys, simple questions where you get people to fill in a text box, or maybe they do multiple choice response, and lots of different options like that, then Qualtrics is very flexible for that. It's less flexible for running the kinds of experiments we would normally run in a cognitive psychology lab, where we're collecting reaction times, and we're expecting a little bit of flexibility with presenting sounds and stimuli for fixed durations and so on. But one feature that we found it did have was file download and upload. So we were able to use this in a quite handy way to give our participants an experiment that they could download as a file and then re-upload when they completed it. And I'll talk about that in a second. Gorilla is the platform that I use most often now, and it's very widely used in UCL because the people who created it actually were formerly students and researchers at the university. It's an experiment building software, so this is really set up to allow you to construct experiments as they might have looked in the lab if you'd programmed them in, presentation or MATLAB or something like that. There's great flexibility, fantastic tech support, and a good user community. Their help materials are fantastic. So, you can go and browse those for free and have a look at what can be done on the platform. But again, it requires a license. So basically, you have to pay for each participant you bring through your experiment. I can't remember the exact fee, but I think it's something like 75 pence in our currency. So it's not nothing. And that means that you do have to account for paying your participants per go, or your university might get a site license where then they have a certain number of tokens that can be used by people at the uni. And then finally, I'm just going to briefly mention that, of course, you can use custom built platforms. So those of you who have the expertise and the access to the secure server space may wish to set up something, on your own server space and run it there. But you can use that in interaction, for example, with recruiting your participants on Prolific, or even going through some basic bits of your experiment on Gorilla and then re-diverting them to your custom platform and back again. So there are pipelines you can set up that can be quite smooth. So I'm just going to start talking about where we started. And I actually must acknowledge my colleague, Nadine Lavan, whose picture you'll see at the end. But she works at Queen Mary University. And prior to that, she worked with me. And prior to that, she came up with this really clever idea when she was working at Brunel University of using Qualtrics with PowerPoint to run an experiment. And I'm going to talk you through how we did this. So what we were interested in was how people recognize identities from voice clips. And one thing that we really wanted to investigate was when you go about your daily lives speaking, actually your voice can sound quite different from one moment to the next. So I'll sound different now when I'm giving this presentation to an academic audience, perhaps than I would if I call my mother later on to have a chat on the phone, or if I'm feeling a bit tired or a bit sad or a bit angry. You'll get variation in my voice. And actually that means that if you gave someone 20 recordings of my voice collected over 2 weeks, you would find that they might find it quite difficult to recognize that all of those sounds just came from me and not several different people. So we wanted to test this observation formally with an experiment. And what we did was an experiment called voice sorting. And the task was indeed a PowerPoint slide, just like you're looking at here. And on the slide, each of these little squares with a number inside was attached to an embedded sound file. And each sound file had a clip of a voice. And there were 2 voices across all of these sound clips with 15 examples each with variable content. And what the participants were asked to do is they weren't told how many talkers were present. They were just asked to click on the sounds and listen to them and drag them around the screen into little clusters to indicate the different voices that they heard. So if they thought they heard a few different sounds from the same talker, they should pull those together in the screen into a little pile, and then another talker would go together into another little pile, and so on. And so what happened was, using Qualtrics, we were able to bring our participants to a link where they filled in some survey responses about their familiarity with the stimuli that we were going to play to them that came from a TV show. They were answered some questions about demographics and so on. And then what we did was we asked them to go through the task. So they downloaded a PowerPoint file, they sorted everything out, and then they re-uploaded it to us, and then we could analyze it by looking at how many of these clusters they've made. So for example, if they were listening to these clips here.
Do you need me to write it down for you?
Well, that's all of life. Jesus, just you make me beg you? Come on, just stick it in there.
These are example clips from the television show Breaking Bad. This is a pretty popular TV show. I never watched it myself, but now I can recognize the voices very well. And we included 15 sounds from each of the character Hank and the character Walt. And what we found was, when we got people to do this task, participants that we'd recruited from Twitter who had seen the show performed differently from people who had not seen the show before. So what you see up here is a solution produced by someone who had seen the television show. And broadly, you can see that they've identified that there are mainly 2 different voices present. They'd seen the show, they were familiar with the voices, and although we didn't tell them how many they needed to find in the task, they pretty much accurately found 2. Whereas here's an example of someone who was not familiar with the show and didn't know the actors, and you can see that they perceived there to be something like 10 different identities. So this was a really neat way that we could just reach into the survey software and use a simple PowerPoint slide to run a valid experiment. And we've published a number of studies using this method over the years. But of course, that's not going to be enough for you in terms of the things that you want to do when you run online research. So we did then quite quickly turn to an experiment builder, this software gorilla, in order to carry out the kinds of tasks that we would more typically run in the lab. So although we still actually use PowerPoint for these voice sorting slides quite successfully, we had to move on. So we moved to this gorilla platform. So what I'm going to do is just talk you through very briefly the kinds of tasks that we have run using Gorilla, just to give you a sense of the nature of the kinds of responses and stimulus presentation we can achieve. So, for example, if we wanted to test people on the recognition of voice identities, the way that tasks are set up in Gorilla is via a graphic user interface. Is very intuitive, and you build a task based on basically putting content into different screens on the experiment. So your first screen might have instructions, the next screen then might have a stimulus, and the final screen might have a response call. So here, imagine we're testing people in voice recognition. We can get the first screen to play them a sound, and the second screen then gives them a number of options for asking them to recognize who is speaking. Now, that could be people that they know because we're testing them on their recognition of characters from a TV show, or it could be people that we've familiarized them with in an earlier part of the experiment. I mentioned that we're interested in sort of giving people their own new voice, and the way that we do that is through paradigms where we familiarize people with associating the sound of a particular voice clip with themselves, a different voice clip with a nominal friend, and another voice clip with a stranger. And after they have that kind of training, then we test them, for example, on presenting them with one of those sounds and a label and asking them to tell us, does that label match or is it a mismatch? And what we tend to find is that people are faster and more accurate to recognize voices that have been tagged to themselves than they are to recognize these voices that are associated with other identities. And so we can measure reaction time, and we can measure the button press that was made by the participant to perform that task. So all other types of identity tasks that we can run with people, instead of presenting just one sound on a screen, we can give them 2 sounds, one after the other, and ask them to tell us on the next screen, were these 2 sounds made from the same person or were they made by 2 different people? We can enter multiple modalities of presentation. So we could, for example, instead of giving them a pair of sounds, we could give them an image of a face and then a clip of a voice and ask them, do these 2 things come from the same person? Or do you think it's a face of one person and a voice of another person? And also we're interested in collecting information about other types of impressions and percepts that we get from talkers. So we often do studies on trait perception. So we might play people a sound, and then instead of giving them a button press response, we would ask them to use a little slider to slide along the screen from a scale of 1 to 9. For example, how much would you trust this person? And if we want to get a more implicit sense of trusting, then, for example, we could present people with different voices and get them to play something like an investment game, where on the screen after they've heard the sound, we could ask them, how many units of currency do you want to invest in this person in the context of a game? And then they would find out how much that person's willing to give them back. So we've got lots of different options of how these things can be done. You can collect from people questionnaire type responses as well. You could get them to type into a text box. You can measure how fast people do things and how accurately, trial by trial. And so within Gorilla, when you build an experiment, you do it via this kind of flowchart interface. It's very intuitive. It's very smooth to interact with, and you can go and look at it after this talk. But basically what you can see here in the screen grab that I've taken is this This is sort of like your start point where your participant might arrive via a link from Prolific where you've recruited them. And then they go through looking at an information sheet, given consent, and then you would start to put them through the sort of task elements of your experiment. And those might vary according to your need. But what you can do is you can move these little nodes around and collect them. You can put in randomization nodes, so people get kind of randomly assigned to different tracks of your experiment. Within each node, for example, a task, in that task, you will have designed sort of how you want your screens to be set up. You can include multiple trials. You can set those trials to be randomized in order. And you can then also randomize or counterbalance the order of the different tasks within this overall outline. So there's lots of flexibility in the way that you might have done when you were, for example, using Psych Toolbox or something like this to code up an experiment on your own machine in the lab. And you can do things that are quite helpful, like you can divert a participant out of your experiment early if it turns out that they don't have the right equipment. So you might have advertised your study saying, please do this on a computer and please wear headphones. And then you can work out actually that they're not wearing headphones, and you can divert them out early and put them back to Prolific and let them know that actually they can continue with your experiment. So there's lots of different things you can do and great flexibility. And if you are someone who has additional technical needs than these simple kinds of tasks I've outlined, it is possible to dig into the JavaScript that goes behind this interface and actually custom script things. So there is greater flexibility, again, than what I've shown you here. So this has been very successful for us because we've run any number of tasks to address all of these different research questions, playing sounds, showing text, showing video, and so on. And we found that that can be quite successful and quite user-friendly, and again, very well supported. But I did say that sometimes we have used a sort of custom platform. And in fact, there's one main occasion when we've done this before, where what we wanted to do couldn't easily be achieved within an available platform like Gorilla. And my only tip that I can give you there is that if you have the expertise yourself, then that's great. If you don't, then identify a collaborator who might be able to support you to do these things. So one of the examples was my PhD student, Brian E. Payne, was interested in this question of giving people a new self-voice. And I've talked about this a little already. And what she had found was, yes, people get faster and more accurate to recognize things that have been artificially tagged as themselves compared with things that have been tagged to other identities. But what she wanted to know was, how does that kind of perceptual prioritization change if I've actually used that voice to communicate socially? So I've actually, made it the sort of expression of my identity and my intentions. So she wanted to give people this novel self-voice in an experiment, but get them to use it socially. And what she wanted them to do was use it in a conversational sort of gameplay with another participant. And then she wanted to see how that would affect their sense of bias prioritization. So what she did was she reached out to a colleague at Heriot-Watt University in computer science, and he was able to set up a game platform for us on his own server. And also he had an existing relationship with a company called Cereproc who make text-to-speech synthesized voices. So we were able to harness both of these connections to set up the following. So we had our participants recruited from Prolific online. We directed them to Gorilla, and there we gave them their information about the study, we gained their consent, and we introduced them to this novel voice recording within Gorilla. And then we redirected them to Angus's custom game platform. And in that platform, they went through a game with another player who'd been linked to the platform. And they basically typed to each other. And the only way that they could get each other's messages was to hear those typed messages read aloud by the computer in a synthetic voice identity. So this way, the players became familiar with that voice identity as being the agent of their message to the other player, and they heard the other player via their text to synthesis voice as well. And so what they did was they kind of played a game where they instructed each other on how to draw pictures, and then the other player would have to guess what they were drawing. So it was a little bit like Pictionary, if you're familiar with that board game. And when they'd done this, then they got rediverted back to Gorilla to do the tasks that we used to run before on the bias toward the voice, and then finally back to Prolific to receive their payment. So you can see that there are ways that you can kind of take a core framework and expand it and slot in novel elements if you have the resources to do so. So for the rest of the talk now, I'm just going to talk about a sort of an example pipeline of a study that we might have run online, just kind of talking you through the things that we think about and the way that we plug together the different elements when we're collecting data from people that we can't see. So imagine that we're running a study in Gorilla. So we have a little task like a voice recognition task, and now we want to build up around that the whole pipeline from participant recruitment through to analyzing our data. So when we've got our participants from Prolific and we've given them the link to our Gorilla study, they will arrive, and the first thing that we'll do is we'll give them information about the study. Now, in the lab, we always give people a sheet of paper with information, and then maybe give them another sheet which has a list of statements to which they can give their consent about how their data will be used and how their anonymity will be protected, and giving their overall consent to participate. So one thing that is important to consider is if you are moving your research from in-person to online, then make sure that you have updated your ethics application with your university or whoever gives you your ethical approval to make sure that they are satisfied that you're able to conduct your research ethically online. So for example, we have approval from our university to collect consent via checkboxes on an online form. We no longer collect handwritten signatures of individuals. So that's one element that we would have had to change in our ethics approval before we can now go on with our research. So those are things for you to consider, not just what happens in the experiment itself, but how you're going to make sure that works within your ethics framework. And then let's look at this experimental outline. So I'm going to start by sort of talking about sort of technical checks that we might want to run with the participants. Then we run them on our task, which in this case would be a voice identity task, could be anything else. And then the portion that we call the debrief. So if we talk about the audio check, think about the kinds of things you want your participants to do in your online study. I am more often than not presenting them with sounds, so I definitely want to make sure they can hear them. So can people hear the sounds in my experiment? For you, it might be something to do with the size of the text on the screen or the size of a video or something like that. Only you can know what it is you would really like to make sure that you can have some control over. And so what's quite nice about Gorilla is that they have a resource which is called Gorilla Open Materials, where researchers who have had to solve a problem for a task or a technical element can share their materials, and you can then incorporate them into your study. And Emma James at York has designed this lovely little quick fire test just to make sure that people are hearing the stimuli come out over their headphones or over their speakers. So she allows them to adjust the volume. They play a little sound by pressing the button, and that is a spoken word. They can play it as many times as they like and adjust their volume till it's comfortable. And then they can type into the box what they think the word is. And Gorilla will automatically compare that with the stored answer. And if it's correct, they get to move on and stay in the experiment. So that's a super quick way to check are sounds coming out of their computer as I want them to. But in many of my experiments, I would like to be a little more careful about how people have their setup. I don't want people listening to stimuli out of a phone. So actually in Gorilla and Prolific, I make sure I pre-filter for people who are using a computer. I also don't want people to be without headphones. I don't want them listening over speakers. So there are a couple of different published tasks, one of which we've used quite a lot and the other one we started using recently, which will basically allow you to do a check that participants are actually wearing headphones. So the one by Woods and colleagues basically plays a trio of sounds, and it asks the participants which one was the quietest. And the way that's set up is that if you're not wearing headphones, you can't do the task properly. You can't hear the differences. But if you are wearing headphones, you can do it. So then we can basically check if they get a certain number of these trials correct, we're happy for them to continue in the experiment and that they're wearing headphones of a sufficient standard. So usually for us, that's the main check. We want to make sure that they have heard what they need to hear. You might have other things, as I said, that you want to check, like you could show them a quick video and ask them to tell you something about that so that you can check that they've actually seen its content. Then comes a task that we kind of slot in. That's the main meat of the experiment sandwich. And here we want to really make sure that we're collecting good quality data on our task. To do that, I'd recommend that you give clear instructions, that you include vigilance checks, and I'll talk about that in a second, but little checks that people are actually attending to what's going on during the experiment and not, having a phone call with their friend while they randomly press buttons. And also we want to keep boredom at a minimum. And I will say it again, but what's really important when you're doing online research is not to forget that somewhere at the end of that internet connection is another human. and you want to look after them nicely as you would do if they came into the lab. So giving clear instructions, remember that when you're in the lab, typically you'll bring someone in, sit them down, get them comfortable, have a chat, and you'll talk them through the instructions, and they'll immediately be able to ask you if they've got any problems. You don't really have that opportunity online as easily or as directly. So you want to make sure that you don't use overly technical language. So instead of saying stimuli, just tell them you're going to play them sounds. That's much easier to understand. Don't go too heavy on text. Make sure that you use text efficiently so that the small messages that you're presenting are effective and they're not just getting bored and, skipping past your long text. And also be clear. Remember, they can't ask for those clarifications online, even though they can write to an experimenter on something like Prolific. Most of our online participants, they've got a job to do. They want to get through that experiment and they don't want to have to stop in the middle and start asking for clarification. So imagine then we've come up with our task. For the sake of this example, it's a voice discrimination task. We put our participants through maybe 60 or 70 trials where they hear these pairs of sounds and they have to give us a decision. And we've got that all set up in Gorilla, but we want to think about how we can make sure that they're actually doing that task and not just, clicking an answer every time randomly just to get through the study. So that's where we include vigilance checks. Now, the choice of vigilance check will depend on your experiment. Think about what it is that they're doing already and think about what it is you need to check that they're paying attention to. So if there's something that they should be looking at on screen, then give them a vigilance check that requires them to tell you about something on the screen. And if it's something that they should be listening to, then ask them to respond to something you've played them over the headphones again. So we usually keep the vigilance tasks very easy because they really should be there to check that the subject is engaged with what they're doing. So if they're really hard, that becomes difficult because they might miss them just because they're hard. You want to check that they're attending. So we keep it easy, we keep it integrated with whatever's going on. So for example, if I were doing a voice identity study and I wanted them to recognize identities, then every so often I might include a really, really iconic voice like Homer Simpson or Barack Obama, someone who has a really distinctive, famous voice. And if they can recognize that person really easily, then I can be confident that they are engaging with the task and I can check that they should have all of the time got those answers right. If I'm asking people to maybe do an evaluation and tell me, how trustworthy is this person from 1 to 9, then sometimes I'll include a sound clip that isn't one of the experimental clips. It's just an audio instruction saying, please press 7 now, or please press 2 now. And then I'll check that they've pressed the number that they were told to press afterwards. So you can thread these in and decide in advance how many of these would you expect your participants to get right in order for you to be satisfied that they must have been attending throughout the experiment. Keeping boredom at a minimum. Make your task as engaging as possible. I think that actually I'm quite fortunate that playing people voice clips, asking them to think about personality traits and showing them videos can often be quite entertaining compared with a lot of experiments. That's not always the case. So think about the ways in which your task might become fatiguing and tiring to a person in the lab. In the lab, they're on their best behavior because they've come in. You might be like watching them through the window to make sure that they're doing the task, and they're going to really try for that hour. If they're online, they might just be more likely to get tired, to get bored, to think, I don't really want to do this anymore, and just stop halfway through. So try and keep it engaging. You might actually want to think about keeping your tasks shorter and testing your conditions across groups of participants rather than all within the same participant. And you can also, in things like Gorilla, show them like a little progress bar so they can actually see that they're working through the experiment and they know when it's going to be over soon. So those are just some little tips just to kind of keep people fresh. I would recommend not putting people under an experiment online for more than 30 minutes and incorporate it into that time for going through the information sheet, time for a couple of questionnaire questions after the task. So do think about that. If you give someone an hour and a half of material, they might just give up halfway through and then it's been a waste of everyone's time. So that brings me on to the debrief, which is the kind of final crucial component of this sort of outline. So going back to the idea of there's a big difference between having someone in the room with me where I can, really sit down and tell them what the experiment's about, and having someone I never see on the other side of the world sitting at a computer that I have no control over. So what we do is we have an opportunity to ask people after they've done our tasks to tell us what happened. So Gorilla will actually give you a very detailed data output, and they will tell you things like what browser the participant was using, what operating system their computer or mobile device was, and so on. But you can always ask the participant to give you some of that information themselves. Gorilla might tell you the sound played perfectly, but the participant might say, actually, sometimes the sound cut out early, or it didn't play at all, or the video was too small, or something like that. And this is very valuable feedback because unlike your lab machine, you can't see or hear what it was like for that participant. So they might actually give you some insights into something you got wrong. Also, you can find out what participants made of the task. They can tell you if they thought the instructions were complicated, or they weren't really sure if they got it right. If they tell you that and then you see their data look a bit strange, then you can actually then comfortably exclude the participant and think, well, yeah, actually, I don't think I can comfortably and confidently analyze their data in line with my research questions. And finally, you can also do further data quality checks, such as what I would call an honesty check. So I mentioned before that sometimes we recruit people because we want them to know a particular TV show so that we can sort of put them in a group of familiar participants for a voice recognition task. Now, sometimes a person might really want to do your experiment and they haven't seen the television show, but they think, I'll give it a go. I want to try. I want to get the money for the experiment, and they'll put themselves in for the experiment. So what you want to do is give that participant the chance to be honest with you. And so sometimes at the end of the experiment, we say, we know you volunteered as a fan of this TV show, but if you volunteered just because you wanted to do the task and actually you haven't seen the show, we would really appreciate if you would tell us honestly now. We will still pay you, but it benefits us to know so that we can treat your data appropriately. And occasionally you will find that somebody will come clean and tell you, yeah, actually, I did this and I shouldn't have. And in the end, I think it's better to have paid that person, but know what the quality of the data really is, than to falsely assume that they were familiar, but somehow were just poor at the task. And one crucial piece of advice is, before you do run your experiment, pilot your task. So one of the great benefits of testing online is that a study that would have taken you weeks of in-person testing, one at a time, can be collected in an afternoon. You can collect hundreds of data sets in one sitting in parallel, but you really want to be sure that you got your experiment right before you open the gates and let all those people in, because if they do the experiment honestly, you should pay them. And if you got it wrong, it's your own fault. So pilot it, run it on yourself, run it on your lab mates, even maybe do a practice experiment on Prolific. Just recruit 5 people and give them a few extra questions at the end about what they thought about it so that you can refine your setup. It's all extremely valuable to just make sure you can get that right. When it comes to instructions, actually, a tip I received from another researcher that I haven't tried yet is you can actually, into your Gorilla task, you could include a tiny quiz about the instructions for your experiment. So if you want to make sure that they've really got it and they understand what they have to do, you could ask them a few quick response choice, sort of forced choice questions to verify that they understand what they need to do before they move on. So there's lots of ways you can think about giving the participants the best chance to understand what they need to do and the best chance to explain to you what it is they've experienced in case that mismatches with what you expected. So talking about checking the data. So, imagine everything is done now. You've got data sets. You've understood which participants should be, taken account of if they've said something that, went wrong or whatever. But now you want to really work out what to do with those data. So for your Vigilance trials, we mentioned you might pick some sort of task that you think they should get right and then check whether they have got that right. Set your criteria in advance. And maybe you can exclude participants who failed a lot of those trials. And you do have justification on a platform like Prolific to actually refuse payment for those participants and say, you didn't get it right. We did give you clear instructions. Because you didn't do it right, we can't use your data. And unfortunately, we can't pay you. With these easy and obvious Vigilance trials, our experience is that very few participants fail them. So, it's a really nice and easy check that people are okay and they're on board with your experiment. But note that this won't get rid of all low effort responses. So you need to be vigilant too and think, is there anything that looks strange about this data? And if so, I've got to be a bit more cautious about including it in my analysis. So you must be vigilant too. If a participant told you they had technical issues, then take note of that, because that might spoil your chances to be able to analyze those data accurately. Even if the participant was doing their best, if they didn't see all the videos, then you can't analyze their data. There might be something about one bit of your study that turns out to look like the data across all participants look a bit strange, maybe a bit low. You might notice something like very slow responses, like you're expecting people to give responses within a second of seeing the stimulus, but instead you're seeing 20 seconds. There's something going wrong there, so take note. Also, you might have a study where you're, for example, doing a learning experiment, and you really want to be careful about, they should get 20 minutes of learning and then do a task. If you see that your participant started at 12 p.m. but didn't finish till, that night, 10 p.m. or the next morning, then you want to consider excluding that participant because they didn't do the task in the same time frame that you expected. All that said, however, and this is going to be probably my closing comment, do remember that these are real people, real participants, and we really must treat them to the ethical standards that we expect, or that we would like to be treated as participants. So if you're in any doubt and you think, I'm not sure these data are usable, but the participant told me that they did all the vigilance checks, that they knew the instructions, that they were really on board, give them the benefit of the doubt and pay them. I think that's an important message. And I know it's tough when we have limited resources, but the best that we can do is set up an experiment that is so super clear that these complications won't arise. I'm going to skip my voice production slides because I said I probably wouldn't have time, but I have put some tips there that my colleague learned about how to do voice production research online. And I'm just going to move to my concluding slide. So I think as a sort of overall summary, I think testing online can be better for researchers. Sure, we can't do EEG and MRI online, but for behavioural research, we have access to larger and more diverse participant samples, better availability of participants if we're stuck on a small campus and we can't find people in person. And as researchers, that gives us better access to research. I, as a researcher, have better access to research when I can find people online any time of the year than if I'm stuck in a location where I can't find them. And in many ways, it's better for the participants. It widens participation. People in different locations who wouldn't normally be engaged with a university environment, for example, can participate in research. They can be paid securely. You reduce their demands. So you reduce the demand on them traveling to see you, for which they might not get paid. You can reduce their need to have in-person contact with strangers, which of course is a concern for people right now. And so there are lots of ways that I think that's good for both sides of the contract, if you like. It's still research with humans, and ethics are crucial. So always think about that participant and think about what they're experiencing and what you can do to make that a smooth experience for them so that you get good quality data in return. So I just want to thank you for listening and thank the various members of my lab over the last years who have supported me in my online research, and the Leverhulme Trust who funds my research. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a very simple, clear, and very informative talk. Sir, would you like to add something?
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot. This was wonderful. Very insightful. Maybe I can ask a question. It was great hearing about what works, but from your experience, are there within your domain of research or otherwise, are there things from your experience that certainly don't work online? I mean, just so that our participants know, maybe this is not worth trying. Could you perhaps elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've focused on the things that we've been able to do successfully. We definitely have. There are some things that I'm a bit less confident about in some respects. So we've had some tasks where we've been measuring reaction times. where actually, we've had maybe a task where someone presses a button and hears a sound, and we compare that with where they hear a tone and then hear a sound. And some of that has been a little bit awkward to manage compared with when we are, setting something up on a calibrated machine where we know exactly how long things have been played for, exactly when they play. So for example, an example of something that's gone wrong with timing is in our most recent speech production study. My colleague was recording people's speech from the start of a trial to the end, and she had timed such that Gorilla would, send a call to the microphone to start recording information. And what she found was that there was sometimes a delay between sending that call and actually starting to record, so that she missed the start of the sentences that the participants had produced consistently across an experiment. So she had to then basically build in extra buffer time to accommodate that. So she found out that kind of thing by testing a small number of people and noticing that sometimes she was missing the start. And some other things that can go wrong are if you do some of these checks, like the headphone check, sometimes that can actually eliminate quite a large number of participants who are indeed wearing some sort of headphone, but they're finding the task a bit challenging and it goes wrong, and they end up having to be maybe quite conservatively rejected from the experiment. So there are some things that, you do have to get a feel for. And of course, there will always just be certain types of study that we just, we would never put online. But I think it's always about sort of trying out what works, especially in your lab environment, and seeing, okay, if I were to be doing this online as a participant, would I find it to be fully clearly explained without having to answer more questions? And that usually helps to clean up some things that aren't obvious to the person who designed the experiment.
Great, thanks. Shreya, we can have some of the participants ask questions.
Yes, sir. So I can invite Nasha to ask her question. She's mentioned it.
I can read it here, so that works as well.
Yeah, it's a little long question.
Right, yeah, okay, so there's two parts to the question, and one is about if we basically survey our participants and they all give us kind of different feedback on what went wrong, then how do we decide how to change the experiment? That's a great question. The second question is about are people doing things like eye tracking? I'll deal with that one first. I think they are, I think that there's now a sort of beta toolbox for eye tracking on Gorilla that some people are using. And usually when they try and build new features in, they do it by contacting a few people that they knew had been working with them to try and run that type of study, and then giving them the kind of the tool and asking them to kind of give them feedback, and then they'll eventually release it to all users. So I think eye tracking actually is something they're doing at Gorilla, which is nice. The second, so the other question, so what you'll find actually is that if you give people the opportunity to tell you if anything went wrong or what you thought of the experiment, most people don't write anything, or they say it was okay. So I've given you the impression that you're going to receive, 400 responses of people saying, oh, this was funny or that. Actually, it's only probably really finding out when something crucially went wrong. So I think that's quite helpful. It's not overwhelming. So usually when you do end up getting a detailed response from someone, it's something that matters. And therefore you can sort of isolate that and act on it. So I think that hopefully is a bit reassuring, because yes, I completely agree. If you had, if you surveyed everyone's opinion about it in detail, then you would probably come up with quite a lot of different opinions.
Thank you so much. Shirley asks, does this testing online influence participants' behavior in behavioral experiments? Like, do their online setup?
Yeah, right. Hard to know, really. So we have run a study where we were interested in kind of giving people the impression that, you're playing a game with another talker and you're going to hear them speak and you have to decide how much money to give them, and then they're going to decide how much of that money to give back to you. And it was one of those kind of trust investment games. And we never really tried to be too we didn't try to deceive them overtly and say, like, there's a real person there and they're really speaking to you now, because we thought it was unrealistic. And to a certain extent, actually, our findings suggested that people didn't really engage with the voices as if they were real players. And I think that probably is because they knew it was probably technically not likely that they would really get to play this game with somebody else. But there are people who have tried to kind of compensate for these kinds of expectations of the participants by doing things like, you put a fake screen up with a little, dial going around going, waiting, just connecting with player 2, and things like this, so that you give people the sense that, like, there's somebody on the other end of the line. So I think there are ways you can work around it with deception, in the hope that people would then behave as they would if they really thought somebody was in the next room or something like that. I have a colleague who also works in auditory research called Kyle Jasmine, and he works at Birkbeck University, and he has been doing quite fine-grained speech perception tasks, where he's interested in the kinds of cues that people use to make decisions about auditory stimuli. And he actually ran a study online using Gorilla and got his results, and then he replicated the study in the lab and got the same results. And you can find different examples of studies where they've tried to do that, to sort of validate the online findings with in-lab studies. And I think this gives me a chance to say something that I think is quite, I think I always found it reassuring, actually, in a strange way. But when I went to Jenny Rod's talk a few years ago, and I mentioned her talk at the beginning of my presentation, and she said, one of the things that people get really worried about is that when people are online, they just won't do the studies properly, and the data will be unusable, and people will cheat and all of these different things. Now, we must consider that this is possible, but she puts the question to us to say, think back to the studies you did in your lab. In what ways did you design those studies to make sure people weren't cheating, to make sure that people were attending all the time, and to make sure that they were, fully engaged with the task? And if I'm honest, I ran a lot of studies in the past where I would spend some time explaining things to the participant, and I would sit them down at the computer, and because they were supposed to be in a soundproof room, I wouldn't necessarily close the door, leave, and come back when they were finished. So I have no idea if they were eating something in the middle that they pulled out of their pocket, or checking their phone, or whatever. I assumed that because they were in my presence, sort of in the same building, that they would do the task properly. And I think a lot of us have done that in the past. So a lot of the things that we build in when we put our research online should give us the reassurance that actually we're designing our experiments probably more carefully than we used to do in the past. And hopefully then when we return to the lab, we'll actually bring some of that back with us to make sure that we're doing that. So I think, in response again to Shelley's question, I think that yes, there probably will be certain types of things where it's just hard to really generate that realistic sense online, like a social interaction study or something like that. Good quality, replicable findings across the lab and online.
Thank you so much for that question. We had another one pop in, right? Thank you for that illuminating talk. Definitely a lot of good resources to look further into. I had a question. The remote experimental task you mentioned seemed suitable when in the lab. The same task would have been conducted over a desktop or a computer device. Have you come across experiments that require a more natural setting in the lab? For example, behavioral experimentation and social cognition. In the same way, do you think that having your voice stimuli be recorded versus live makes a difference in your results?
Yeah, I think I mentioned maybe some things relevant in response to the last question, but yeah, I think one of the things that when we think more about social processes, we do want to think more about giving people a realistic sense of a live interaction, and you can do that by faking it. You can sort of give people cues that suggest that there's another player there. There are people who have done, I think, more custom-built research where they actually have been able to give people a genuine experience of playing a game simultaneously with other people. So we had one go at this when we had people. I wasn't able to show you the environment because it would have taken too much time, but the player, arrives at a game, they pick a picture that they're going to describe, and then they describe the picture in text to the other player who is truly in another online room listening to those instructions. That person uses a drawing interface to draw a picture and then writes a message back saying, I'm ready, or whatever. So that was truly live and truly interactive. In the end, as it happens, all of that interactivity didn't affect how much bias people showed to the text voice. So even when they didn't get to play this game and didn't get to use the voice in depth, they showed the same level of bias towards it because they just said, well, I guess this is mine, so I own it now, and I'm biased toward it. So that was just our finding. But I do think there are clever ways that people are working around this. Live versus recorded stimuli, definitely something I am constantly thinking about in all of my research, because, we're always asking people to do things like tell us how much they would trust someone or how attractive they are, or all those kinds of things. And the participants are clearly aware they're just listening to sound files that have been recorded on a previous occasion. So even for my in-lab research, it's something I'm thinking about all the time. And I haven't quite yet played poorer quality recordings, like things that could have been actually made. If I were to give people recordings that had been made on like someone's mobile phone or something like that sound like they're not lab quality, it might actually give more of that sense of like, oh, this was a real person on their real phone, rather than, this kind of very synthetic kind of lab recording. So it's something I do think about a lot. But for your own research, I think you would want to think, do I want to put in fake components to convince someone they're in a social interaction? Or do I want to think about actually trying to recreate something with the tools that are available?
Right. Thank you so much for that answer. Right. So we do not have any more questions. Those were some interesting questions. And again, a lovely presentation. Thank you so much. With that, we'll end the session for today.